My dad's been gone for a month now, and I'm still untangling the mess he left behind. Not because of him, but because of his wife, Lisa, and her two daughters, Amber and Haley. My dad married Lisa 3 years ago, and since then, everything's felt off. But let me start from the beginning. About 8 years ago, my mom passed away. They'd been married for over 30 years, and her death hit him hard. He fell into a deep depression, couldn't focus at work, and eventually lost his job. Without an income, he fell behind on rent, got evicted, and ended up sleeping in his car for a while. I was the only one he had left, so I stepped in. I bought a modest little house in a quiet neighborhood, nothing fancy, but safe, with a nice yard and enough space for him and his old beagle Max. That house became his safe space. For the first couple of years, he slowly started rebuilding his life. Max was always by his side, following him around the yard or curling up on the couch while Dad watched old westerns. I visited every Sunday without fail. We'd grill burgers, share a few beers, and talk about everything and nothing. For a while, it felt like he was healing. Then Lisa entered the picture. They met through some church friends, and things moved fast. Within 6 months, they were married. I didn't object. Dad seemed happy, and Lisa seemed fine, polite, cheerful, always quick with a smile. When he told me she was moving in, I didn't protest. It was his life, his choice. But Lisa didn't come alone. First, her older daughter Amber showed up. She was in her mid-20s, no job, no apparent plans, and carrying more luggage than seemed reasonable for a short stay. But she wasn't just visiting. She moved in. A few months later, the younger daughter, Haley, joined them. Now, instead of my dad living quietly in the house I bought for him, there were 4 people crammed inside: Dad, Lisa, Amber, and Haley. The place started changing. Pictures of my mom that used to hang in the hallway were replaced with family photos of Lisa and her daughters. Dad's recliner, his favorite spot in the living room, got pushed into a corner to make space for Lisa's oversized sectional. Every time I visited, there was less of him in that house and more of them. At first, I tried to brush it off. My dad didn't complain, so I figured maybe he was okay with it. But it was hard to ignore how different he seemed. He spoke less, smiled less, and mostly stayed in his room when I visited. Lisa, on the other hand, acted like she owned the place, giving me tours of rooms I'd already seen 100 times, showing off decorations I knew my dad wouldn't have chosen. The real breaking point, though, was Max. Max was more than just a dog. He was family. After Mom died, Max became my dad's shadow, his comfort. He was old, slow-moving, and gentle. The most danger he posed was accidentally tripping someone if they weren't watching where they stepped. But Amber and Haley started complaining about him. Amber said his fur triggered her allergies. Haley said she felt unsafe around him because he barked occasionally when someone knocked on the door. I brushed off their complaints at first because, honestly, they sounded ridiculous. But then Lisa started bringing it up too, how maybe it was time for Max to go to a new home. I could see how much it hurt my dad. He didn't argue back. He just shrank into himself more. I think he was too tired, too beaten down to fight over it. That's when I stepped in. I told my dad I'd take Max. I wasn't about to let them bully him into giving up the last piece of my mom he had left. Dad looked so relieved when I said it, but also heartbroken. When I took Max home with me, it felt like I was carrying away a piece of my father's soul. From then on, every time I visited, I brought Max with me. And every time, Amber and Haley acted like I was walking in with a rabid wolf. Amber would make these exaggerated coughs whenever Max walked past her, and Haley would leave the room altogether, muttering something about how she couldn't relax with Max around. Lisa would give me these tight, fake smiles and say, "Oh, you brought him again." But Dad? Dad would light up every time he saw Max. He'd scratch behind Max's ears, whisper little things to him, and for a few minutes, it felt like the house was his again. Then one day, Lisa said it outright, "I think it's better if you stop bringing Max when you visit. It's just causing too much stress for the girls." I didn't lose my temper, but I was furious. I told her straight, Max wasn't going anywhere. If they didn't like it, they could stay out of the living room when I visited. Lisa didn't like that answer, but she didn't push back. The tension in the house grew thicker after that. Every visit felt like walking into enemy territory. Lisa and her daughters would go silent when I walked in, like I was interrupting some secret meeting. They stopped offering me coffee or even acknowledging me when I said hello. My dad seemed more tired than ever, and he barely spoke during my visits. I started to see the pattern. Lisa and her daughters weren't just living in that house. They were waiting for Dad to pass, waiting for their chance to take over completely. But here's the thing. They had no idea the house wasn't even his. It was mine. I bought it, I paid for it, and legally, it was still in my name. I didn't want to bring it up while my dad was still alive. I didn't want him to feel like his home was hanging over his head. But with his health declining fast and hospice care looming, I knew it was only a matter of time before Lisa and her daughters started making plans for a future they weren't entitled to. And I was going to make sure they found that out the hard way. When Dad finally moved into hospice care, everything felt heavy. The house, the air, the silence. Like the world was holding its breath, waiting for something inevitable to happen. I visited him every day, sometimes staying for hours, sometimes just long enough to sit beside him while Max lay curled at his feet. Lisa and her daughters rarely showed up. When they did, it was mostly for show. Quick visits where they'd talk loudly about how hard it all was for them, then disappear again, leaving me and Max to sit in that quiet, sterile room with Dad. Back at the house, things were getting worse. I'd stop by to grab mail or check on things, and every time, it felt less like my father's home and more like Lisa's personal kingdom. Amber and Haley had fully settled in, spreading their stuff across every available surface. Haley had taken over the guest room and turned it into what looked like a personal salon. Flat irons, makeup, piles of clothes everywhere. Amber had set up a home office in the dining room, despite not having a job. One evening, I stopped by after work to drop off some papers for Lisa to sign regarding Dad's hospice care. I knocked on the door, waited a full minute, and finally let myself in with my key. Lisa was in the kitchen pouring herself a glass of wine, and Amber was on the couch with her laptop open, watching reality TV. Neither of them even acknowledged me when I walked in. "Hey," I said, trying to keep things civil. "I need Lisa to sign these papers for Dad's insurance." Lisa barely glanced up. "Leave them on the counter. I'll get to them later." Her tone made my teeth clench, but I stayed calm. "It's kind of important. It'd be better if you could just sign them now." She sighed dramatically, put down her wine glass, and walked over. She signed the papers without reading them, handed them back, and turned away before I could say another word. I stood there for a second, looking around the kitchen. The fridge was covered in photos of Amber and Haley, sticky notes about yoga classes, and grocery lists written in Lisa's cursive handwriting. My father's old calendar, where he'd mark my visits and Max's vet appointments, was gone. "Where's Dad's calendar?" I asked, more sharply than I intended. Lisa turned around with a fake, tight smile. "Oh, it was so outdated. I tossed it. It's not like he's using it anymore." I felt a flash of anger, but swallowed it down. It wasn't worth it, not yet. Instead, I turned and walked toward Dad's room. I wanted to grab a few of his personal things to bring to the hospice, but when I opened the door, I froze. His room had been completely rearranged. The bedding was different, the shelves were cleared off, and his nightstand, the one where he kept a framed photo of my mom, was gone. In its place was a stack of Amber's fashion magazines. "What happened to Dad's room?" I called out. Lisa appeared in the doorway, arms crossed. "Amber needed more space, so we moved some things around. James isn't coming back here anyway. It's just practical." It felt like a slap in the face. My dad wasn't even gone yet, and they were already erasing him from his own home. I walked past Lisa without another word, grabbed Max's old leash from the hallway closet, and left. Over the next couple of weeks, I focused on Dad. I sat with him, fed him soup when he could still eat, played old recordings of my mom's favorite songs. Lisa stopped showing up entirely. Amber and Haley came once or twice, but spent most of the time scrolling through their phones, complaining about the hospice chairs being uncomfortable. When the call finally came, it felt both sudden and inevitable. Dad was gone. Just gone. I sat in my car outside the hospice for almost an hour, Max asleep in the passenger seat, trying to process the fact that he wasn't there anymore. The funeral was small and quiet. Lisa cried loudly in the front row, clutching a handkerchief and glancing around to make sure everyone noticed. Amber and Haley sat behind her, looking bored. I stayed close to Max, who lay at my feet, his head resting on my shoe. After the service, Lisa cornered me in the parking lot. "So, about the house," she said casually, as if we were discussing dinner plans. "James wanted us to stay there, you know? It was his dying wish." I stared at her, stunned. His dying wish? He never said anything like that to me. She pouted, tilting her head like I was being unreasonable. "Well, he told me. He wanted us to have stability, a place to heal after all this grief." I couldn't stop myself from laughing bitterly. "Grief? You mean the grief you've been showing by redecorating his room while he was still alive?" Lisa's face turned red, and she took a step closer. "You're being incredibly disrespectful right now. We've been through so much." "No," I interrupted. "You've taken so much. But we're done here. That house isn't yours, Lisa. It's mine. I bought it. I've been paying the taxes, the insurance, the maintenance. It was never Dad's to give to you." She froze, her mouth hanging slightly open. For once, she didn't have a quick comeback. "I'll give you 3 months," I said, my voice low and steady. 3 months to either start paying rent or pack your things and leave." Amber and Haley appeared behind her, both looking as shocked as Lisa. Amber tried to jump in. "You can't just kick us out. We live there." "You've squatted there," I shot back. "But that's over now." Lisa's tears started, but they were the crocodile kind. "You can't do this to us. James wouldn't have wanted this." I shook my head and turned to leave. "You've got 3 months. Make the most of them." Walking back to my car, I felt a strange mix of sadness and relief. Sadness for my dad, for the way his final years had been overshadowed by these women who saw him as nothing more than a means to an end. Relief because, finally, I was taking back what was mine. But I knew Lisa wasn't going to go quietly. People like her never do. And I was prepared for whatever came next. It didn't take long for Lisa to start fighting back. I gave her 3 months, but within 2 weeks, I started getting text messages, long, rambling ones about how she had nowhere else to go, and how I was disrespecting my father's memory. She tried guilt, she tried anger, and when neither worked, she switched to fake politeness. She even suggested we could all sit down and talk things through like adults. I ignored most of it. There was nothing to talk about. The house was mine, and they had no right to it. But then she took it a step further. I got home from work one day to find an envelope taped to my door. Inside was a formal letter from a lawyer. Lisa was planning to challenge my ownership of the house. The claim was absurd. According to her, my dad had made a verbal agreement that the house would be hers after he passed. There was no paperwork, no will, nothing to back this up. Just her word. I called my lawyer immediately. He went through the letter, shook his head, and said, "She doesn't have a case. But this is going to waste your time and money." And he was right. Over the next few weeks, Lisa and her lawyer dragged me into pointless meetings and hearings. Each time, she showed up dressed in black, clutching tissues, trying to play the grieving widow. Her lawyer spun ridiculous stories about how she'd poured her heart and soul into the house, how she'd taken care of James in his final days, and how it would be cruel and unjust to make her leave the home she had built memories in. What they didn't mention was how she'd redecorated my father's room before he was even gone, how Amber and Haley had treated him like an inconvenience, or how Lisa had all but abandoned him in hospice while she sipped wine in the kitchen of a house she didn't own. The judge wasn't buying it. My lawyer laid out every piece of evidence, property deeds, bank statements, utility bills, all in my name. It was open and shut. But Lisa wouldn't let go. One day after another exhausting hearing, I stopped by the house to grab some of my dad's old tools from the garage. When I walked in, the place was a mess. Boxes were piled in the living room, half open with clothes spilling out. Amber was sitting on the couch, scrolling through her phone, and Haley was sprawled across an armchair painting her nails. Lisa appeared from the hallway. "What are you doing here?" she snapped, her voice sharp. I held up my hand. "Relax. I'm just here to grab some stuff from the garage." She followed me outside, her arms crossed over her chest. "You know, this whole thing is cruel. You're being so cold-hearted. James wouldn't want this. I turned to face her. James would be devastated if he knew what you've turned his home into. You and your daughters have taken over every inch of this place like you own it. But you don't. And you never will. For a second, I thought she was going to slap me. Her face went red. Her hands clenched at her sides. But she said nothing. I grabbed what I needed and left. A week later, Lisa called me. Can we talk? Please. Her voice was softer this time, almost pleading. Against my better judgment, I agreed to meet her at the house. When I arrived, Amber and Haley were nowhere to be seen. Lisa had set up 2 chairs in the backyard. She was holding a photo album, one of my dad's old ones. We sat down, and for a moment, she seemed almost genuine. She flipped through the album, showing me photos of my dad smiling, holding Max, sitting on the porch. I loved him, you know, she said quietly. I really did. I looked at her, trying to see any hint of truth in her eyes. If you loved him, why did you let your daughters treat him like a guest in his own home? Why did you let them push him around, complain about Max, and rearrange everything he cared about? Lisa's expression hardened. You don't understand. It wasn't easy for me either. I stood up. I think we're done here. She didn't stop me as I walked back to my car. Whatever sympathy I might have had for her was gone. The court date finally arrived. Lisa had one last chance to convince the judge she had a claim to the house, and she blew it spectacularly. Her lawyer tried to make the same tired arguments, verbal agreements, emotional investments, promises made in confidence, but none of it mattered. Legally, the house was mine. The judge gave them 30 days to vacate the property. No more extensions, no more excuses. 30 days, or they'd be forcibly removed. After the ruling, Lisa refused to look at me as we left the courtroom. Amber was muttering under her breath, and Haley was crying, though I doubted it was real. Over the next few weeks, I drove by the house occasionally to check on things. Each time, there were fewer cars in the driveway, fewer lights on at night. They were packing, but slowly, like they thought they could stall long enough for me to change my mind. But I wasn't changing anything. The final day of their 30-day notice came, and I showed up at the house with my lawyer and a locksmith. Lisa's car was gone, but Amber and Haley were still there, sitting on the porch with their arms crossed. You don't have to do this, Amber said as I walked up the steps. Yes, I do, I replied calmly. The locksmith started working on the front door while Amber and Haley grabbed their last few bags. As they walked past me to their car, Amber turned around. You're a real piece of work, you know that? After everything we've been through, you're just throwing us out like garbage. I didn't reply. There was nothing left to say. When the locksmith finished, I walked inside. The place was empty, but it felt hollow, like a shell of what it used to be. I walked through every room, taking in the damage they'd left behind. Scuff marks on the walls, broken cabinet doors, stains on the carpet. But despite all of that, there was relief. The house was mine again. My father's memory could finally rest without being overshadowed by Lisa's entitlement or Amber and Haley's selfishness. Max was waiting for me in the car, his head sticking out the window, ears flapping in the breeze. I let him out, and we walked into the backyard together. He sniffed around the grass, his tail wagging slightly, and for the first time in months, the house felt peaceful again. It wasn't perfect, and it was going to take time to fix everything they'd done, but it was mine. And that was enough. After Amber and Haley dragged their last boxes to the car and disappeared down the street, I stood in the doorway of my dad's house, and let out a breath I felt like I'd been holding for months. The silence was almost deafening. No arguing voices, no passive-aggressive remarks, no more fake tears from Lisa. Just me, the empty rooms, and Max sniffing around like he was reacquainting himself with an old friend. The house was a mess. Scuff marks on the walls, stains on the carpet, cupboards hanging crookedly from their hinges. In the living room, there were faint outlines on the wall where Dad's pictures used to hang, now replaced by empty hooks and dust. They hadn't even bothered to clean up after themselves. The fridge was still half full of expired food, and in the upstairs bathroom, Haley had left behind a mountain of used makeup wipes scattered across the sink. I spent the next few hours just walking through the house, room by room, taking stock of what needed fixing. Dad's old recliner was shoved into the corner of the garage, piled under bags of garbage they hadn't bothered to take out. His bookshelf, once full of well-worn novels and framed photos, was now completely empty. It felt like they had tried to erase him from every corner of the house. I decided to start with the backyard. Max followed me outside, his tail wagging as he sniffed the familiar grass. The old grill was still there, rusted but functional, and the patio furniture was covered in a layer of dust and leaves. I sat down on one of the chairs and let Max lay his head on my lap. This house had been my dad's sanctuary. It was where he found peace after losing my mom, where he built a quiet life with Max by his side. And now, after all the chaos Lisa and her daughters had brought in, I was determined to bring that peace back. Over the next few weeks, I worked on repairing the damage. I patched holes in the walls, repainted the living room, replaced the locks, and deep-cleaned every inch of the house. My weekends were spent scrubbing grime out of corners I didn't even know existed, hauling out broken furniture, and throwing away the random junk they had left behind. It was exhausting, but also therapeutic. Each bucket of dirty water, each bag of trash carried to the curb felt like I was scrubbing their presence out of my dad's home. Lisa, of course, wasn't done yet. About a month after they'd officially moved out, I got a call from an unknown number. I almost didn't answer, but curiosity got the better of me. Hello? It's Lisa. Her voice was overly sweet, the kind of tone someone uses when they want something from you. I stayed silent, waiting for her to get to the point. I was just wondering, do you think I could come by and pick up a few things we might have left behind? Just some personal items, nothing big. I already knew where this was going. They hadn't left behind anything worth coming back for, unless she was suddenly sentimental about broken cabinet doors and expired yogurt. No, Lisa. You had more than enough time to take everything you needed. You're not coming back here. There was a pause, and then her voice shifted, dropping the fake sweetness. You're such an ungrateful little... I hung up before she could finish. That should have been the end of it, but Lisa wasn't the type to let things go. The following week, I came home to find a note taped to my front door. It was handwritten in Lisa's neat, cursive script. You're a cruel person. James would be ashamed of you. I hope you can live with yourself knowing you've destroyed a family. I crumpled the note and tossed it into the trash without a second thought. Max barked at the door, as if he could still smell her lingering scent. For a while after that, things finally started to calm down. I finished the repairs, replaced the furniture, and put my dad's recliner back in the living room where it belonged. I hung up some of his old photos again, the ones of him and Mom at the lake, one of him holding Max as a puppy, another of the three of us at a 4th of July barbecue years ago. The house started to feel like home again, not just an empty shell. One Saturday morning, I was out in the yard with Max when I noticed a car parked across the street. It was Lisa's sedan. She was sitting in the driver's seat, sunglasses on, staring straight ahead like she wasn't watching me. Amber was in the passenger seat, scrolling through her phone. I considered walking over, telling them to leave, but honestly, I was tired. Tired of fighting, tired of their games, tired of Lisa pretending like she had some kind of claim to this house or my life. So I turned my back, walked inside, and locked the door behind me. That night, I installed security cameras around the property. It felt paranoid, but I couldn't shake the feeling that Lisa wasn't done trying to worm her way back in. Sure enough, 2 days later, one of the cameras caught her sneaking around the side of the house. She didn't do anything, just stood near the fence, looking toward the living room window. I called the police, filed a report, and sent her a text letting her know I had her on camera and would press charges if she came back again. She didn't reply, but I noticed her car wasn't parked across the street anymore after that. With Lisa finally out of my life, I focused on rebuilding. I planted some flowers in the backyard, fixed up Dad's old grill, and started spending weekends out there with Mac's friends came over occasionally, and we'd sit outside with beers, laughing and talking while Max dozed in the sun. One evening, as the sun was setting and the sky turned pink and gold, I sat in Dad's old recliner with Max curled up beside me. I looked around the living room, the photos, the clean walls, the sense of peace that had finally returned. For the first time in months, maybe even years, I felt like I could breathe again. The house was mine, not just legally, but in every sense of the word. Lisa, Amber and Haley were gone. Their chaos swept out with the garbage bags I'd carried to the curb. Dad's memory lived on in the quiet moments. The smell of burgers grilling on the patio, Max snoring softly at my feet. The way the sun filtered through the curtains just right in the morning. Lisa had tried to take it all, but in the end, she'd lost. And I'd won. Not just the house, but my peace. And that was something she could never touch. A few months passed, and for the first time in what felt like forever, things started to feel normal. The house was quiet, peaceful, and most importantly, it finally felt like mine again. I'd settled into a routine. Work during the week, weekends spent in the yard with Max, grilling burgers, just like Dad and I used to do. I had friends over sometimes, and we'd sit on the back patio with beers, laughing about nothing in particular. Max had his favorite spot under the big oak tree, and I'd often find him there, napping in the shade with his tail twitching in his sleep. But peace has a funny way of being temporary. One afternoon, I got home from work and found an envelope stuffed into my mailbox. At first, I thought it was just another piece of junk mail, but then I noticed the return address. It was from Lisa's lawyer. I didn't even wait to get inside. I tore the envelope open right there on my porch. Inside was a letter stating that Lisa was contesting the court's decision and planned to appeal. Her argument was that my father had verbally promised her the house, and that she and her daughters had invested significant time and effort into maintaining it. I let out a sharp laugh. Time and effort? The only thing they'd invested in this house was resentment and cheap furniture. I called my lawyer immediately. He was calm, as always, and told me not to worry. "These appeals rarely go anywhere," he said, his voice steady. "But it'll be another round of hearings. It's annoying, but it's manageable." I hung up and sat down on the porch steps, staring out at the street. Max trotted over and rested his head on my knee, his tail thumping gently against the wood. I scratched behind his ears, feeling exhaustion creep over me. Lisa wasn't just persistent. She was desperate. The appeal process started, and once again, I found myself sitting in a courtroom across from Lisa. She was dressed in black again, clutching the same tissue she'd carried the first time around. Amber and Haley sat behind her, both looking bored and scrolling through their phones like they were at a DMV, waiting for their number to be called. Lisa's lawyer was a different guy this time. Slick, younger, the kind of guy who smiled too much and made too little eye contact. He painted Lisa as a grieving widow who'd been left with nothing, who'd given up everything to care for my dad in his final years. It was all nonsense, but he delivered it with enough fake sincerity that I could see the judge trying to keep a straight face. My lawyer was ready, though. He presented the same evidence, proof of ownership, financial records, property deeds. Nothing had changed. Lisa had no legal claim to the house, and no matter how many tears she managed to squeeze out or how many dramatic pauses her lawyer used, the facts were still the facts. The appeal was dismissed. Again. When the judge read the decision, Lisa didn't cry this time. She just sat there, staring straight ahead, her mouth pressed into a thin line. Amber looked furious, and Haley was biting her nails, her face pale. As we left the courtroom, Lisa caught up with me in the hallway. "This isn't over," she said, her voice low and sharp. "You're going to regret this." I stopped walking and turned to face her. "No, Lisa. You're going to regret dragging this out. You lost. Twice. Move on." She didn't say anything else, just turned around and walked away, Amber and Haley trailing behind her like shadows. After that, I hoped, really hoped, that it was finally over. But Lisa wasn't done. A week later, I noticed my trash cans had been overturned in the middle of the night. A few days after that, I found cigarette butts scattered across my front porch. Neither I nor any of my friends smoked. Then there were the phone calls. Late at night, usually just silence on the other end, or sometimes a faint rustling sound before the caller hung up. I installed more security cameras. Every angle of the house was covered, and I made sure all the footage was saved to a cloud server. One night, I was woken up around 2 a.m. by Max growling softly at the window. I sat up, my heart hammering, and looked outside. Someone was standing near my mailbox. It was too dark to see their face, but I could tell it was a woman. She was just standing there, staring at the house. I grabbed my phone and dialed the police. By the time they arrived, whoever it was had disappeared into the night. The next morning, I checked the security footage. It was Lisa. She had been standing there, motionless, for almost 20 minutes before she finally walked away. That was it for me. I filed for a restraining order. The footage was enough to convince the judge that Lisa was crossing lines, and she was officially barred from coming within 200 feet of my property. After that, things quieted down again. No more phone calls, no more overturned trash cans, no more cigarette butts on my porch. For the first time in months, I felt like I could let my guard down. But Lisa had left a mark on this house, on me. I couldn't walk past certain rooms without remembering how they'd been rearranged, how my dad's things had been pushed aside or discarded entirely. Some days, I'd catch myself hesitating before opening the door, half expecting to hear Lisa's fake, cheerful voice or Amber complaining about Max. But day by day, the house started to feel lighter, brighter. I replaced the curtains in the living room, painted the walls in warm, neutral tones, and hung up more photos of my dad and me. I planted some flowers in the front yard, and Max seemed to approve. He'd trot through the grass with his tail wagging, stopping to sniff every single petal like it was the most interesting thing he'd ever smelled. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, I stood on the back porch with a beer in hand and Max lying at my feet. The sky was painted in shades of orange and pink, and a cool breeze rustled through the leaves of the old oak tree. For the first time in years, the house felt still, peaceful, like a place where good memories could grow again. Lisa had tried her best to take it from me, through manipulation, guilt, lawsuits, and intimidation. But she failed. This house wasn't just a building. It was my dad's legacy. It was where we laughed, where we grieved, and where we found little moments of joy after Mom died. Lisa couldn't take that away from me. And now, with her gone for good, I finally felt like I could breathe again. Weeks turned into months, and life settled into a rhythm that finally felt normal. The house, once filled with tension and chaos, was now my sanctuary. I'd finished fixing up the interior, and with Max by my side, I started working on the yard. It was slow, steady progress, but every weed I pulled, every flower I planted, felt like a step toward reclaiming what had been stolen. Not just the physical space, but the peace that had come with it. One afternoon, as I was trimming the hedges along the driveway, my neighbor Julie came over. She'd lived next door for years and had seen the whole saga play out from a distance. Julie was in her 60s, the kind of person who always knew what was happening on the block, but she wasn't nosy about it. "House is looking good," she said, leaning on the fence with a friendly smile. "Thanks," I replied, wiping sweat from my forehead. She hesitated for a moment before speaking again. "I don't want to stir the pot, but I thought you should know. I saw Lisa's car drive by a couple of nights ago. She didn't stop, just circled the block a few times." I nodded, not surprised but still annoyed. "Thanks for letting me know. I've got cameras set up, and she's under a restraining order. If she tries anything, I'll deal with it." Julie gave me a sympathetic look. "You've handled all of this better than most people would. I hope she finally leaves you alone." "Me too," I said, though I wasn't holding my breath. As it turned out, Julie's warning wasn't just a one-off. Over the next few weeks, I noticed small signs that Lisa hadn't completely let go. Once, I found a bouquet of wilted flowers left on the front porch. Another time, a note stuffed in the mailbox, unsigned, but written in her familiar handwriting. It said, "You can try to erase me, but I'll always be a part of this house." I threw it out without a second thought, but it lingered in the back of my mind. Lisa didn't want the house. She wanted control. She couldn't stand that she'd lost. One night, I was sitting on the back porch with Max when I heard a car slow down in front of the house. I couldn't see much through the hedges, but the sound of tires crunching gravel made my chest tighten. I pulled up the security feed on my phone and saw Lisa's car parked at the curb. She wasn't alone. Amber was in the passenger seat, leaning forward like she was trying to get a better look at the house. I didn't bother confronting them. I just called the police. By the time they arrived, Lisa was gone, but I gave the officers the security footage and filed another report. This time, I made it clear that I wasn't going to tolerate her harassment anymore. The next day, I got a call from Lisa's lawyer. "Lisa would like to offer an apology," he said, his voice dripping with insincerity. An apology? I repeated, struggling to keep the sarcasm out of my voice. For what? Harassing me? Violating a restraining order? Or dragging me through months of legal nonsense? The lawyer sighed. She wants to avoid further legal action. If you're willing to drop the matter, she'll agree to stay away for good. I'll drop it when she proves she can actually stay away, I said. Until then, the restraining order stands. If she comes near this house again, I'll press charges. He didn't argue. After that call, things finally started to calm down. Weeks went by without any sign of Lisa or her daughters. The house was quiet, peaceful, and for the first time in years, it felt like I could finally move forward. I threw myself into new projects, fixing up the garden, repainting the fence, even building a little doghouse for Max in the backyard, though he preferred lounging under the oak tree. Friends came over more often, and the house slowly became a place of laughter and good memories again. One evening, as the sun was setting, I found myself sitting in Dad's old recliner, looking around the living room. The photos I'd hung on the wall seemed to glow in the soft light. Pictures of Dad, Mom, Max, and me, moments frozen in time. It struck me then how much had changed, and not just in the house. Losing Dad had been one of the hardest things I'd ever gone through, but in a strange way, it had also given me the strength to stand up for what mattered. Lisa and her daughters had tried to take everything, but they couldn't touch what was most important: the memories, the love, the legacy my parents had left behind. Max patted over and rested his head on my knee, his tail wagging softly. I scratched behind his ears, smiling to myself. This house was more than just a building. It was a reminder of where I came from, of the people and moments that shaped me. And now, it was mine again. Fully, completely. Lisa was a chapter in this story, a chaotic, frustrating chapter, but one that had finally come to an end. As I sat there, watching the last rays of sunlight filter through the curtains, I felt a deep sense of peace. The fight was over, the house was mine, and for the first time in what felt like forever, I could just be.